Hey everyone. Tonight we're descending into the darkest truth about family, that some bloodlines carry more than just genetic inheritance. They carry curses that flow through generations like poison in the veins, turning love into horror and legacy into nightmare. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready to discover how certain families become vessels for supernatural vengeance that spans centuries. And let me know in the comments if you've ever wondered why some bloodlines seem doomed to repeat the same tragedies. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to explore the terrifying reality that the sins of the fathers truly are visited upon the children, not through divine justice, but through blood itself becoming the carrier of ancient guilt that demands payment from the innocent until the debt is finally paid in full. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The stones remember. In the hills above Argos, where the citadel of Mycenae crumbles under Mediterranean sun, Heinrich Schliemann's shovel strikes something that should not be there. The year is 1876. The archaeologist expects pottery, perhaps bronze. Instead, his blade scrapes against a death mask of hammered gold, and for a moment, just a moment, the face beneath seems to twist in silent agony. I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon, Schliemann will write, though the mask predates that cursed king by centuries. But names matter little when death wears gold. What matters is that something in the earth of Mycenae has been waiting to tell the world's first story of blood that poisons blood, of sins that flow like wine from father to son to daughter to grave. The house of Atreus did not choose its curse, the curse chose them. Long before Christ walked the earth, before Rome carved its empire from the bones of nations, the Greeks understood something we have forgotten, that some hungers are inherited, that some sins live in the blood itself, passed down like eye color or the shape of a smile. They had a word for this spiritual poison, miasma, and they knew it could contaminate not just a man, but his children, his children's children, until the very name became a prophecy of doom. The tablets found in the ruins of Pylos speak in Linear B script of blood rituals performed by Bronze Age kings, offerings to placate the angry dead, ceremonies to cleanse the stain that no water can wash away. The scribes carved these symbols into clay over 3,000 years ago, but they might as well have been writing tomorrow's obituaries. In the beginning, there were two brothers, Atreus and Thyestes, born to rule, destined to destroy. Their father, Pelops, had already seeded the ground with blood. He had won his bride through murder and treachery, had called down curses on any who would betray him. But curses like wildfire consume everything in their path. They do not distinguish between the guilty and their children. The brothers' war begins, as all the worst wars do, over a woman and a throne. Thyestes seduces his brother's wife. Atreus discovers the betrayal, and in that moment of discovery, something snaps in the bloodline itself. Not just in the man, but in the very DNA of dynasty. What happens next will echo in theatres for millennia. The great hall of Mycenae fills with the smell of roasting meat. Atreus has invited his brother to a reconciliation feast, and Thyestes comes hungry for forgiveness. The torches cast dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that seem to writhe like the souls of the damned. Outside, the Aegean wind carries the scent of approaching storm. The meat is tender. Thyestes tears into it with the appetite of a man who has tasted exile and found it bitter. He praises his brother's generosity, speaks of brotherhood restored, of old wounds healed. The wine flows, the fire crackles, and Atreus watches with the patience of a spider waiting for the fly to discover the web. Only when Thyestes has licked the grease from his fingers does Atreus reveal the truth. The platters before them hold not lamb or beef, but something else entirely. Something that once laughed and played in these very halls. Something that called Thyestes father. The children of Thyestes, butchered, cooked, served, their bones sucked clean by their own father's teeth. In that moment, As understanding floods Thyestes' mind like poison through veins, the curse finds its voice. He vomits up the flesh of his sons, but he cannot vomit up what he has become, the cannibal, the father who consumed his own future. And with his dying breath, he speaks words that will haunt the house of Atreus until every last drop of its blood runs cold. May this house know no peace. May its children devour each other as I have been devoured. May the very stones cry out for justice, and may justice come wearing the face of death. The wind outside grows stronger. In the olive groves the trees bend and break, and in the great hall of Mycenae, Atreus sits alone with empty platters, and the knowledge that he has just fed the beast that will one day consume him too. The Greeks understood something we moderns struggle to accept, that justice is not a human concept. It belongs to older things, darker things, things with wings like storm clouds and eyes like pools of blood. They called them the Erinyes, the Furies, and they were accountants of a sort. But instead of counting coins, they counted sins. And the books always balanced. Always. Thyestes dies in exile, but his curse lives. It moves through the bloodline like a virus, adapting, mutating, growing stronger with each generation. When Atreus fathers Agamemnon and Menelaus, the curse is there at their birth, breathing over their cradles like a black-winged angel. When young Agamemnon learns to walk, his first steps are on ground soaked with his cousin's blood. When he learns to speak, the curse teaches him words of war and betrayal. The clay tablets of Knossos speak of purification rituals, catharsis, ceremonies designed to cleanse the pollution of blood guilt. But some stains run too deep. Some hungers grow too strong. The priests of ancient Mycenae tried everything: animal sacrifice, ritual baths, offerings to the gods. But the curse had roots now. It had fed on royal blood and grown fat. By the time Agamemnon takes the throne, the curse is no longer something that happens to the family. The curse is the family. The ships sit motionless in the harbour at Aulis, their sails hanging limp as a burial shrouds. For weeks now, the Greek fleet has waited for wind to carry them to Troy, to war, to glory. But the wind does not come. The sea lies flat as hammered bronze, reflecting a sky empty of clouds and hope. Agamemnon stands on the cliffs above the harbour, watching his army waste away. Men whisper of omens, of divine displeasure, of curses that follow kings like shadows. And in those whispers, he hears an echo of his father's voice, his grandfather's laughter, the screams of children who died at a feast long ago. The priest Calchas brings the message from Artemis. The wind will not blow until blood flows, not animal blood. They have spilled enough of that to float a ship. Royal blood, young blood, the blood of Agamemnon's own daughter. Iphigenia comes to Aulis, believing she is to be married. She wears white robes and flowers in her hair, and her laughter carries across the water like the song of a bird that does not know winter is coming. Her father looks at her and sees not his child, but the weight of 1,000 ships, the hunger of 10,000 men, the demands of gods and curses and destiny. The altar stone is old, older than Mycenae, older than memory. It has tasted royal blood before. As the bronze knife rises in the dawn light, Iphigenia's eyes meet her father's, and in them he sees the same look Thyestes must have worn when he understood what was in his mouth. The look of someone who realizes that love and hunger can wear the same face. The wind begins to blow before her blood stops flowing. But blood, once spilled, cries out, and somewhere in the darkness between worlds, something hears. Something that has been waiting for this moment, counting sins, balancing books, something that wears the face of justice and the wings of a storm. The curse of the house of Atreus has found its perfect meal. 10 years. 10 years of war, of blood, of men dying on foreign soil while their wives grow old in empty beds. 10 years for grief to ferment into something harder, colder, sharper than bronze. Clytemnestra waits. She counts the seasons by her daughter's absent laughter. She tends an altar built not to gods, but to memory, where Iphigenia's ghost grows stronger with each sacrifice of tears and rage. And in the long nights, when the wind howls through the halls of Mycenae, she sharpens her knife and practices the words she will speak when her husband returns. When Agamemnon's ships finally appear on the horizon, their black sails swollen with victory and spoils, Clytemnestra is ready. She has prepared a bath perfumed with oils and heated with wood that once grew in the sacred groves. She has laid out robes dyed with purple that cost more than a common man's life. She has prepared everything for a hero's welcome, everything except forgiveness. The water is still warm when Agamemnon steps into it, still fragrant with myrrh and cinnamon. He closes his eyes and lets the heat soak into muscles that have known only war for a decade. He does not see his wife's reflection in the bronze mirror. He does not see the net falling. He does not see the blade until it finds the space between his ribs where his heart beats its last rhythm. But he sees his daughter's face. In the moment between life and death, Iphigenia stands at the foot of the bath, no longer a girl, but a thing of wind and shadow and inexorable justice. She smiles, and her smile is the curve of a sickle moon cutting through the darkness of a sky that knows only winter. The water turns red. The curse feeds. And somewhere in the palace, a young man named Orestes hears his father's death scream and knows that his turn is coming. Blood calls to blood. The mathematics of revenge add up to infinity. Orestes flees Mycenae that night, running through olive groves where the trees seem to whisper his name, where every shadow holds the shape of a woman with a knife. He is barely old enough to shave, but already he carries the weight of a choice that will define not just his life, but the very nature of justice itself. The oracle at Delphi speaks in riddles, but her meaning is clear. The mother killer shall be cleansed. The son must balance the scales his father unbalanced. Blood for blood, life for life, the old law must be satisfied. But which law? Which blood? Apollo demands vengeance for a father's murder. The Furies howl for retribution against anyone who would kill the woman who gave him life. And Orestes stands between them like a man caught between two armies, knowing that any choice he makes will damn him. He returns to Mycenae in disguise, bearing news of his own death. Clytemnestra receives him in the same hall where her husband died, where the bloodstains have been scrubbed away but never really cleansed. She mourns for the son she believes she has lost, and her tears are real even as her hands are stained. When Orestes reveals himself, when he speaks the words of judgment and raises the same blade that killed his father, something breaks in the air itself. The curse, which has fed on 3 generations now, reaches a kind of critical mass. As Clytemnestra falls, her blood mingles with the phantom blood of all who have died in this place. Thyestes' children, Iphigenia, Agamemnon, and the very stones begin to sing with the voices of the murdered. But this death is different. This death breaks the pattern. They come for him before his mother's body is cold. The Erinyes rise from the earth like smoke from a sacrifice, their wings dripping with the blood of all the unavenged dead. Their eyes are coals, their breath is the last gasp of the dying, and their voices are the sound of justice grinding its terrible teeth. They have waited so long for this moment, the moment when the mathematics of revenge finally create a perfect paradox. Orestes runs, but there is nowhere to run. He hides, but there is nowhere to hide. The Furies follow him across the known world, their voices growing louder with each step. Mother killer, matricide, abomination, the blood on your hands will never wash clean. But something new is stirring in the world. Something that was not there when the curse began, when Atreus first served his brother that terrible feast. The city of Athens has risen, and with it, a new kind of justice. Not the justice of tooth and claw, of blood for blood and eye for eye, but the justice of reason, of law, of human beings trying to rise above the beasts they once were. Athena herself comes down from Olympus to judge the case. The first jury in human history assembles in the shadow of the Acropolis. Apollo speaks for Orestes, arguing that a father's blood matters more than a mother's, that some killings are justified, that the old ways must give way to new. The Furies howl their opposition, demanding that the ancient laws be honored, that blood guilt be paid in full. The jury votes, the count is tied. And in that moment of perfect balance, Athena casts the deciding vote, not for the old justice or the new, but for something harder to define, for mercy, for the possibility that chains can be broken, that curses can be lifted, that human beings are more than the sum of their ancestors' sins. Orestes is freed. The Furies are transformed, no longer vengeful spirits, but guardians of a deeper justice, protectors of the innocent, rather than punishers of the guilty. And the curse of the house of Atreus, which has fed on blood for 3 generations, finally starves. The ruins of Mycenae still stand, weathered by wind and time but unbroken. Tourists walk through the Lion Gate, where Agamemnon once rode in triumph to his death. They photograph the treasury of Atreus, unaware that they are standing on ground that once drank royal blood like wine. They read plaques that speak of Bronze Age civilization and archaeological significance, but the plaques do not mention the screams that still echo in the stones, because some things cannot be excavated. Some truths live not in pottery shards or golden masks, but in the stories we tell ourselves about the nature of guilt and innocence, about what we inherit from our fathers and what we choose for ourselves. The House of Atreus gave the world its first great meditation on the terrible mathematics of revenge. It asked questions that we are still trying to answer. Can the sins of the fathers be visited upon the children? Is justice served by an endless cycle of retribution? Or is there a point where someone somewhere must choose to break the chain? The Greeks, who understood curses better than anyone, gave us both the question and the answer. The curse lives in the blood until someone chooses to bleed it out. The cycle continues until someone decides it ends. The hunger grows until someone refuses to feed it. But the choice is always ours. In the museum in Athens, Schliemann's golden death mask stares blindly at visitors with empty sockets that have seen too much. The placard identifies it as the Mask of Agamemnon, though scholars now know it belonged to someone else entirely. Someone whose name is lost, but whose face is preserved forever in hammered gold. The mask speaks without words of a truth the ancient Greeks knew well. That curses do not care about truth, they care only about stories. And stories, once begun, must find their way to an ending. Even if that ending takes 3,000 years, the stones remember. They always remember. And sometimes, late at night when the wind blows through the ruins of Mycenae, visitors claim they can still hear something singing, a sound like wind through empty sockets, like blood dripping on marble, like the laughter of the long dead who know that some hungers never truly die. They just wait for the next feast to begin. In the archives beneath the Vatican, there exists a manuscript that bears no author's name. Written in Latin that predates the Vulgate, its pages speak of bloodlines touched by powers older than Christ, older than Moses, older than memory itself. The monks who copied these words in medieval scriptoriums would cross themselves 3 times after writing each page, and more than one was found dead at his desk, his quill still wet with ink that had somehow turned the colour of dried blood. The manuscript speaks of the Merovingians, the long-haired kings who ruled Francia before Charlemagne's ancestors seized the throne. but it speaks of them not as men who wore crowns, but as something else entirely, something born from the union of woman and beast, carrying in their veins the essence of powers that God had cast from heaven. Power corrupts, but some power is corruption itself, seeking vessels worthy of its hunger. The first Merovingian king, Merovech, claimed descent from two fathers, one human, one divine. But the manuscript in the Vatican archives tells a different story. It speaks of a queen who wandered too far into the deep forests of ancient Gaul, who heard voices calling from groves where no Christian foot had yet trodden. It speaks of a bargain made in darkness, of seed planted in soil that had drunk the blood of druids in their sacrifices. It speaks of a child born with eyes that reflected no light and a hunger that no earthly food could satisfy. The Merovingians ruled for 3 centuries. In that time, no enemy army could stand against them. No plague touched their lands. No harvest failed while they held power. But success, like failure, has a price. And the price was paid not by the kings themselves, but by their children. The royal nurseries of the Merovingian palaces were places of whispered terror. Wet nurses would not sleep alone with the royal infants, claiming the babies would stare at them through the night with ancient eyes. Court physicians spoke in hushed tones of children born with too many teeth, with fingernails sharp as claws, with birthmarks that looked like brands burned into their flesh. And always, always there were the dreams. The dreams came to every Merovingian child on their 7th birthday. The same dream, passed down through the bloodline like a genetic memory. They would dream of a great hall beneath the earth, where kings who had died centuries before their birth sat on thrones of bone and smiled with mouths full of black blood. And in the dream, a voice would speak from the darkness between the thrones, offering them the same bargain their ancestor had made: power without limit, victory without end, and a crown that would never leave their bloodline. All they had to do was remember what they truly were. Most of the children would wake screaming, some would wake laughing, and a few, the ones who would become the greatest kings, would wake hungry. When Pepin the Short finally overthrew the last Merovingian king in 751, the official records speak of political necessity, of a dynasty grown weak and corrupt. But the monks who chronicled those events knew better. They wrote of exorcisms performed in the throne room of the Merovingian palace, of holy water that boiled when it touched the royal crown, of crosses that cracked and bled when brought near the deposed king. The Merovingian line was not defeated, it was contained, sealed away like a poison in a bottle, with prayers and relics and the hope that time would weaken what steel could not destroy. But blood has a way of seeping through even the strongest seals. In the deepest vaults of the French National Archives, there exists a genealogy that traces certain noble families back to the Merovingian kings. The document is kept under lock and key, not for its historical value, but for its prophetic power. Because every name on that family tree, from the 8th century to the present day, tells the same story. Wealth beyond measure, power beyond reason, and death that comes too soon and too strangely for coincidence. The Habsburg jaw was not a defect, it was a mark. A sign that the blood of Merovech still flowed in royal veins, still carried its ancient hunger, still whispered its dark promises to those who would listen. But the Merovingians were not the only dynasty to make such bargains. In the scorched hills of Wallachia, another bloodline learned to feed on more than bread and wine. Vlad Dracul was not the first of his line to earn the name Dragon. The Order of the Dragon, founded by King Sigismund of Hungary, claimed to serve God and Christianity against the Ottoman threat. But the rituals performed in the Order's secret chambers had roots that ran deeper than any church, tapping into veins of power that predated Christ by millennia. The Draculist took their name from the dragon, but the dragon was not merely a symbol. In the mountains of Transylvania, where mist clings to ancient forests, and wolves howl in languages older than Latin, the distinction between man and monster has always been more fluid than elsewhere. The boyars who served the Draculesht spoke in whispers of their master's true nature, of the way his shadow fell wrong in firelight, of the appetite that no amount of food could satisfy. When Vlad the Impaler took the throne of Wallachia, he brought with him a hunger that had been growing in his bloodline for generations. The forests of stakes that surrounded his capital were not merely tools of war or governance, they were altars. Each body pierced and raised toward the sky was an offering to powers that demanded payment in pain and terror. The Ottoman chroniclers who wrote of Vlad's atrocities could not understand what they were witnessing. They saw only the cruelty of a madman, the excess of a tyrant drunk on power. But the few who survived encounters with Vlad himself spoke of something else. They spoke of a man whose eyes held no reflection of soul, whose presence made horses scream and dogs flee, whose touch left marks that burned like brands. They spoke of a man who was no longer entirely human. The line of Dracul died with Vlad, or so the histories claim. But in the villages that still nestle in the shadow of the Carpathian peaks, the old women know better. They speak of children born with the dragon's mark, of families who move only at night, of bloodlines that carry the hunger in their veins like a virus that never dies. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the mist rises from the valleys like the breath of the sleeping dead, they speak of travelers who vanish from the mountain roads, leaving behind only empty clothes and the metallic smell of fresh blood on the wind. Biblical scholars have long debated the nature of divine justice, the question of whether the sins of the fathers are truly visited upon their children. But for those who study the darker passages of Scripture, the answer is written in blood across the pages of history. The house of Saul provides the clearest example. When the first king of Israel disobeyed the direct command of God, when he spared the Amalekite king whom the Almighty had doomed to death, he did not merely forfeit his own crown. He condemned his entire bloodline to a fate worse than death. The curse that fell upon Saul's house was not metaphorical. It was literal, physical, immediate. His sons died in battle, not because they were poor warriors, but because their blood carried the stain of their father's disobedience. His daughter Michal, who married David, was cursed with barrenness. The line of Saul would have no future, no continuation, no hope of redemption through offspring. But the most terrible fate was reserved for Saul himself. The king who had once been chosen by God found himself abandoned by divine providence, left to seek counsel from powers that dwelt in darkness. When he consulted the witch of Endor, when he called up the spirit of Samuel from the grave, he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He opened a door that could never again be closed. The Battle of Mount Gilboa was not a military defeat, it was an execution. Saul and his sons fell not to Philistine swords, but to the judgment of a God who had marked their blood for destruction. And when Saul fell upon his own sword, rather than face capture, his death was not an act of courage, but an acknowledgement of the inevitable, that some curses can only end in annihilation. The chroniclers of the medieval period understood these biblical precedents better than modern scholars. They saw in their own royal bloodlines the same patterns, the same inexorable mathematics of divine retribution. When they wrote of kings who died young, of princes born mad, of dynasties that rose to glory only to fall to degradation, they were not merely recording history. They were documenting the workings of a justice that operated by laws older than human comprehension. The Capetian dynasty that ruled France for over 3 centuries carried its own burden of blood guilt. Hugh Capet, the founder of the line, had seized power through murder and treachery, crushing rivals whose only crime was a better claim to the throne. The crown he won was stained with innocent blood from the moment it touched his head. For generations, the Capetians prospered. They expanded their kingdom, accumulated wealth, built cathedrals that reached toward heaven like stone prayers. But the chroniclers who served in their courts whispered of strange omens, of children born with webbed fingers, of queens who gave birth to monsters that died before drawing their first breath. The curse that had slept in Carpathian blood for 3 centuries finally woke when Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, burned at the stake in 1314. As the flames consumed his flesh, the dying Templar spoke words that would echo through French history like a death knell. God knows the truth. Before this year is out, both Pope and King will stand before the throne of judgment. Pope Clement V died within a month. King Philip IV followed him to the grave before the year ended, and in the decades that followed, the Capetian line began to devour itself with a hunger that would not be satisfied until every drop of royal blood had been spilled. Louis X died at 30, poisoned by wine that had turned to venom in his cup. John Wayne lived only 5 days, succumbing to an illness that no physician could name or cure. Philip V lasted 8 years before his blood turned to water in his veins. Charles IV ruled for 6 years before choking on air itself, gasping for breath that would not come. The direct Capetian line died with Charles IV, but the curse did not die with it. It flowed into the collateral branches, the Valois and the Bourbon dynasties that claimed the vacant throne. And with each new generation, the hunger grew stronger, more inventive, more terrible in its appetites. By the time the Revolution arrived, the curse had ripened to full maturity. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette went to the guillotine not merely as symbols of royal excess, but as final offerings to powers that had waited 5 centuries for their payment in full. The blood that flowed from the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution was not just the blood of 2 monarchs. It was the accumulated debt of an entire dynasty, finally and irrevocably paid. But even then, the hunger was not satisfied. It followed the scattered remnants of the royal bloodline into exile, into obscurity, into the shadows where curses go to wait for new vessels to fill. In the genealogical records of European nobility, certain patterns emerge that no rational scholarship can explain. Families that should have thrived instead withered and died. Bloodlines that commanded vast wealth and power found themselves reduced to madness and poverty within a single generation. Children of ancient houses were born with deformities that physicians could not account for, afflictions that seemed to spring not from nature, but from something darker and more deliberate. The historians who documented these patterns did so in Latin, in codes, in metaphors that would hide their true meaning from casual readers. They understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to be spoken plainly, that some truths could only be whispered in the darkness between official records. They wrote of the blue blood, not as a metaphor for nobility, but as a literal description of aristocratic veins that carried something other than healthy red hemoglobin. They documented births of children with too many fingers, with eyes that never blinked, with cries that sounded like the screams of the damned. They recorded deaths that came without cause, sicknesses that struck only those who carried certain names, accidents that followed bloodlines like faithful hounds. And always, always, they wrote of the hunger, the insatiable appetite that drove noble houses to seek power not for its own sake, but as fuel for something that lived in their blood like a parasite, feeding on authority and influence and the ability to shape the world according to inhuman desires. The royal bloodlines of Europe did not merely rule nations, they served as vessels for powers that had no earthly origin, no mortal limitations, no understanding of human mercy or justice. They were not kings and queens in any meaningful sense, but puppets dancing to the tune of masters who dwelt in spaces between the stars, in the darkness that exists in the gap between one heartbeat and the next. When the age of monarchy finally ended, when the last royal dynasties fell to revolution and war and the simple passage of time, those powers did not disappear. They simply found new vessels, new bloodlines to corrupt, new families to mark with their terrible gifts. The names changed, the faces changed, the crowns became corporate logos, the throne rooms became boardrooms, the royal bloodlines became family dynasties that measured their wealth in dollars rather than ducats. But the hunger remained, and the hunger always finds a way to feed. In the private libraries of certain ancient families, there exist genealogies that trace their lineage not to kings and queens, but to older sources, darker sources, sources that ruled when the world was young and the distinction between divine and demonic had not yet been carved in stone by human theology. These families know their true nature. They know what flows in their veins, what whispers in their dreams, what drives their insatiable need to accumulate power and influence and control over the lives of lesser mortals. They know that they are not truly human, not in any sense that matters. They are vessels, carriers, living embodiments of hungers that predate civilization itself. And they are waiting, always waiting, for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right combination of circumstances that will allow them to feed as their ancestors fed, to rule as their ancestors ruled, to transform the world into the image of their inhuman desires. The blood remembers what the mind forgets, and royal blood has a very long memory indeed. The earth settles back into place over Peter Plagojevich's violated grave with a sound like a sigh. The villagers of Kiselova pack the dirt with their boots, each footfall a prayer that this time death will hold. But their faces carry no relief, only the grim satisfaction of soldiers who have won a single battle in a war that has been raging for centuries. The year is 1725, and the Austrian Empire has sent its officials to investigate reports of the impossible. What they find in the soil of this Serbian village will be documented in meticulous detail, filed in imperial archives and forgotten by history until scholars, decades later, stumble across testimonies that read like nightmares written in bureaucratic prose. The corpse they exhume should have been decomposing for 10 weeks. Instead, it lies in its shroud as if sleeping, skin flushed with the bloom of health, fingernails grown long and sharp, mouth stained with blood that could not possibly be its own. When the village blacksmith drives a hawthorn stake through the heart, fresh blood wells up around the wooden point like a spring uncapped, and something that might have been a scream escapes from lips that have spoken no words since the burial. But Peter Plagojevich was not the first of his line to return from death hungry for the living. In the villages that huddle in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, where mist rises from ancient valleys like the breath of the earth itself, the old women speak of families marked by a thirst that no amount of wine can slake, a hunger that grows stronger with each generation, passing from father to son to daughter, like a birthright written in blood. The Plagojevich name appears in parish records dating back 3 centuries, always accompanied by the same whispered addenda, mortuus non mortuus, dead but not dead. Church officials who bothered to investigate these rural superstitions found patterns that defied both science and theology. Children born to the Plagojevich line consistently displayed certain characteristics: an aversion to sunlight that went beyond mere sensitivity, canine teeth that grew longer and sharper than human anatomy should allow, and a pallor that no amount of healthy living could cure. More disturbing were the deaths that seemed to follow the family like a faithful hound. Neighbors would weaken and die of a wasting sickness that physicians could not name, their blood growing thin and pale until their hearts simply forgot how to beat. Livestock would be found drained and lifeless in fields where no predator could account for the precise wounds at their throats. And always, there were the sightings. Family members seen walking the roads at night weeks or months after their funerals, moving with a purpose that belonged neither to the living nor the properly dead. When Austrian officials finally opened Peter's grave in response to his widow's terrified testimony, they were not investigating a single case of suspected vampirism. They were documenting the latest manifestation of a hereditary condition that had plagued Eastern European bloodlines for generations, a condition that medical science could not explain, but folk wisdom understood all too well. The blood carries memory, and some memories are older than the families that inherit them. In the mountains of Moravia, where wolves still howl in voices that sound almost human, the Czellakovice cemetery holds secrets that archaeologists are only beginning to understand. The graves discovered there in 1994 tell a story written in iron stakes and severed heads, in bodies buried face down and limbs weighted with stones, the desperate measures of communities that knew death was not always final. But these were not random graves. The skeletal remains, when subjected to DNA analysis, revealed familial relationships that spanned centuries. Fathers, sons, brothers, cousins, entire bloodlines interred with the same careful precautions against resurrection. The archaeologists who excavated these sites found evidence of rituals performed generation after generation, communities that had learned to recognize the signs of tainted blood and act accordingly. Dr. Ladislav Kovář, the forensic anthropologist who led the Czellakovice excavation, speaks carefully when asked about his findings. The official reports document medieval burial practices and superstitious beliefs. But in private conversations, away from academic colleagues and peer review boards, he admits to discoveries that challenge everything modern science believes about death and decay. Some of the bodies, he says, his voice barely above a whisper, showed signs of life activity that continued long after burial. Not decomposition, the opposite. As if something in their blood was fighting the natural process of death, keeping tissue alive and functional in ways that should be impossible. The iron stakes driven through the hearts of these buried vampires were not symbolic gestures. Chemical analysis revealed that the metal had been treated with compounds that would have been toxic to living tissue. Compounds derived from plants that grew only in certain mountain valleys, places where the soil itself carried a legacy of ancient rituals and older hungers. The families that performed these burials were not acting out of ignorance or superstition. They were following protocols developed over centuries of hard experience, methods refined through trial and error and the accumulated wisdom of communities that had learned to live alongside the undead. But knowledge, like blood, can be corrupted. And sometimes the hunters become the hunted. The Wallachian chronicles speak of the Strigoi Morti, the living dead who return from their graves to feed on their descendants. But they also speak of the Strigoi Zawa, the living vampires, humans born with the hereditary ability to drain life force from others without the inconvenience of first dying themselves. These bloodlines carried their curse openly, wearing it like a crown. They did not hide their nature or pretend to be something they were not. In the feudal hierarchy of medieval Eastern Europe, they occupied a unique position. Nobles who ruled not through divine right or military conquest, but through the simple fact that their subjects were too terrified to rebel against masters who could kill with a touch and return from death with the persistence of a bad debt. The von Bathory family exemplified this tradition. For 6 centuries, they ruled vast estates in Hungary and Transylvania, accumulating wealth and power that seemed to grow despite wars, plagues, and political upheavals that destroyed their contemporaries. Their castle at Chaktic became a pilgrimage site of sorts, a place where other vampire bloodlines would send their children to learn the arts that could not be taught in ordinary schools. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, was not an aberration in her family line. She was its culmination. The chronicles that document her crimes speak of torture chambers equipped with instruments designed not merely to inflict pain, but to harvest specific bodily fluids with the precision of a vintner selecting grapes. Her private apartments contained bathing chambers lined with silver and jade, metals that certain alchemical traditions claimed could purify and concentrate the life essence found in human blood. When Hungarian authorities finally investigated the reports of mass murder at Chaktic Castle, they found evidence of industrial-scale vampirism. The cellars contained the remains of over 600 young women, their bodies drained so thoroughly that the investigating officials initially assumed they were looking at some form of mummification. But chemical analysis of the castle's drainage system revealed traces of iron-rich compounds in concentrations that could only have come from massive quantities of fresh blood processed and disposed of over decades. Elizabeth herself, when questioned under torture, spoke not of madness or cruelty, but of necessity. She claimed that her actions were dictated by biological imperatives as natural as hunger or thirst, that the blood of others was not merely desired but required for her continued existence. Her interrogators, men of science and reason, dismissed these claims as the ravings of a madwoman. But the Bathory line did not end with Elizabeth's death. It scattered, fragmenting into smaller branches that carried the tainted blood to new territories, new communities, new hunting grounds. Parish records from across Central Europe document the arrival of minor nobility bearing the Bathory name, always followed within months by reports of mysterious illnesses, unexplained deaths, and children who aged too quickly while their supposed parents seemed to grow younger with each passing season. The Habsburg court employed genealogists whose primary function was not to trace noble lineages, but to identify and monitor bloodlines that carried what they euphemistically termed hereditary afflictions. These scholars maintained detailed records of families suspected of vampirism, documenting patterns of inheritance that followed Mendelian principles with disturbing precision. The condition they discovered was not randomly distributed, it clustered in certain bloodlines, passed from parent to child with the reliability of eye color or height. More troubling, it seemed to strengthen with each generation, as if the tainted blood was refining itself, becoming more potent and more dangerous as it accumulated genetic modifications that served its inhuman purposes. Austrian medical authorities conducted secret studies on captured vampires, subjecting them to examinations that would later influence the development of forensic medicine. What they found challenged every assumption about human physiology. The vampiric bloodlines displayed alterations in bone density, muscle composition, and nervous system function that should have been lethal, but instead conferred abilities that bordered on the supernatural. Their bones were denser than normal human skeletons, but somehow lighter, as if the mineral composition had been altered at the molecular level. Their muscle tissue contained fibers that contracted with inhuman strength while requiring minimal oxygen. Most disturbing of all, their nervous systems showed evidence of structural modifications that allowed for enhanced sensory perception and reaction times that exceeded normal human parameters by orders of magnitude. But the most significant finding was in their blood chemistry. Vampiric blood contained cellular structures that did not appear in any medical textbook. Organisms that seemed to function as both parasite and symbiont, consuming normal red blood cells while producing compounds that enhanced the host's physical capabilities and extended their natural lifespan indefinitely. These cellular modifications were hereditary, passed through genetic mechanisms that scientists would not fully understand until the discovery of DNA centuries later. But the Habsburg researchers recognized the implications. Vampirism was not a supernatural curse or viral infection, but an evolutionary adaptation that allowed certain bloodlines to prey upon others with biological efficiency. The outbreak at Medveja in 1732 provided the Austrian authorities with their most comprehensive look at hereditary vampirism in action. Arnold Pauli recently returned from service in the Ottoman territories, brought with him more than just military experience. His family had deep roots in the border regions where empires met and old hungers fed on the chaos of constant warfare. Paul's transformation followed a pattern that Habsburg researchers had documented in dozens of similar cases. A seemingly normal human being would experience a period of illness or injury, usually involving significant blood loss. During recovery, family members would notice changes: enhanced physical strength, altered sleep patterns, an aversion to traditional foods, and a craving for raw meat. Within months, the transformed individual would begin displaying the classical symptoms of vampirism. But Paolo was not an isolated case. Investigation revealed that his entire extended family carried genetic markers associated with vampiric transformation. Cousins, siblings, distant relatives, all showed evidence of the same cellular modifications, though in varying degrees of development. The conditions seemed to activate under specific circumstances, triggered by trauma or stress that awakened dormant genetic programs encoded in their blood. When Paolo died in a farming accident, his family followed traditional burial practices designed to prevent vampiric resurrection. But their precautions proved inadequate against a condition that had been refined over generations. Paolo's body was exhumed after reports of nocturnal attacks on both humans and livestock, and the examining officials found evidence of continued life activity that defied every principle of forensic medicine. The corpse showed signs of recent feeding. Flesh that should have been decomposing instead appeared healthy and well-nourished. The fingernails had continued growing, the hair remained vibrant and lustrous, and the skin retained the elasticity of a living person. When the examining physician made a small incision to test tissue response, fresh blood flowed from the wound in quantities that exceeded what should have remained in a body dead for weeks. But the most disturbing discovery was genetic. Blood samples taken from the corpse contained cellular structures that were actively reproducing, creating new organisms at a rate that suggested the body was not merely preserved, but actively alive in ways that science could not explain. The vampiric transformation was not simply a suspension of normal death processes. It was an acceleration of life itself, a biological hyperactivity that turned death into a more efficient form of existence. The Habsburg authorities ordered the systematic elimination of the Pau bloodline, hunting down family members across multiple provinces. But their efforts only scattered the tainted blood further, forcing it to adapt and evolve in response to persecution. Vampire families learned to hide their nature, to blend into normal society while carefully managing their inherited hungers. They developed feeding protocols that would not attract attention, taking small amounts of blood from multiple victims rather than draining single individuals completely. They learned to simulate normal human aging through careful application of cosmetics and calculated exposure to sunlight. Most importantly, they learned to identify and recruit new bloodlines that carried genetic markers compatible with vampiric transformation. By the end of the 18th century, vampiric bloodlines had established themselves throughout European society. They infiltrated noble houses through strategic marriages, acquired wealth through carefully planned inheritances, and gained political influence through the simple expedient of outliving their opponents. What had begun as a regional phenomenon in the Carpathian Mountains had evolved into a hidden demographic that shaped the course of European history from the shadows. The medical revolution of the 19th century posed new challenges for vampiric bloodlines. Scientific methods that could detect anomalies in blood chemistry, photography that could reveal details invisible to the naked eye, and record-keeping systems that made it difficult to forge new identities, all threatened to expose their true nature. But adaptation is the hallmark of successful predators. Vampire families began entering the medical profession themselves, using their positions to suppress evidence of their condition and redirect scientific research away from discoveries that might prove inconvenient. They funded studies that attributed vampiric symptoms to rare but natural medical conditions, promoted theories that explained away eyewitness accounts as products of ignorance and superstition. Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing's influential work on sexual pathology, published in 1886, included extensive documentation of what he termed hematodipsia, an abnormal craving for blood that he attributed to hereditary mental illness. His case studies, drawn from patients treated at the Graz University Clinic, provided convenient medical explanations for behaviors that previous generations would have recognized as vampirism. But Krafft-Ebing's private papers, discovered in the university archives a century after his death, tell a different story. His unpublished notes document meetings with individuals who displayed impossible physiological characteristics, patients whose blood samples contained cellular structures that violated every principle of medical science. His correspondence with colleagues across Europe reveals a network of physicians who were quietly documenting evidence of hereditary vampirism while publicly promoting theories that explained it away. The truth was too dangerous to publish. A scientific paper confirming the existence of vampiric bloodlines would have triggered panic across a continent where such families had spent centuries integrating themselves into the highest levels of society. Instead, Krafft-Ebing and his colleagues chose to contain the knowledge, to study the phenomenon while preventing its public recognition. Their research revealed that vampiric heredity followed complex patterns that defied simple genetic models. The condition could skip generations, emerging in grandchildren whose parents showed no symptoms. It could manifest differently in males and females of the same family, with women often displaying enhanced empathic abilities, while men developed more pronounced physical transformations. Most troubling of all, it seemed to be evolving, with each generation displaying capabilities that exceeded those of their vampiric ancestors. Modern genetic analysis has provided new insights into the mechanisms underlying hereditary vampirism. Researchers studying rare blood disorders have identified genetic sequences that appear in families with documented histories of vampiric activity. These genetic markers affect the production of enzymes involved in iron metabolism, creating cellular environments that can support the symbiotic organisms found in vampiric blood. But the scientists conducting this research are careful to frame their findings in terms of medical anomalies and evolutionary curiosities. None dare to suggest that they are documenting evidence of a predatory subspecies that has spent millennia refining its ability to feed on normal human beings. Because in the end, knowledge is power, and power in the hands of predators becomes something far more dangerous than any wooden stake or silver bullet. The vampiric bloodlines of Eastern Europe did not disappear with the coming of modernity. They adapted, as they always have. They learned new hunting methods, developed new camouflage, found new ways to satisfy hungers that grow stronger with each passing generation. In the genetic databases that now track human heredity with unprecedented precision, certain patterns emerge for those who know what to look for. Bloodlines that demonstrate unusual longevity, families that seem immune to diseases that devastate their neighbors, children born with genetic modifications that enhance their physical capabilities beyond normal human parameters. The vampires are still among us. They wear different faces now, carry different names, hunt in different ways. But the hunger remains the same. The hunger always remains the same. And in the mountains of Eastern Europe, where mist still rises from ancient valleys and wolves still howl in the darkness, the old women remember. They remember the signs, the symptoms, the precautions that their grandmothers taught them. They remember that some bloodlines carry more than just genetic inheritance. They carry appetites that no grave can contain, hungers that no amount of time can satisfy. They carry the promise that death, for some families, is not an ending, but a transformation. A metamorphosis into something that feeds on the living and grows stronger with each generation. The blood remembers. The blood always remembers. And vampiric blood has the longest memory of all. In the hills of Appalachia, where family trees grow twisted and secrets run deeper than coal veins, they have a saying: the dead don't stay buried when the living won't let them rest. But sometimes it's not the living who disturb the peace of the grave. Sometimes the dead refuse to stay quiet because their blood still flows in the veins of their descendants, carrying with it the weight of unfinished business. The Browns of Breathitt County learned this truth the hard way. For 3 generations, the Brown men had died violent deaths before their 40th birthdays, car accidents on roads they'd driven safely for years, hunting mishaps with rifles that had never misfired before, heart attacks that struck down healthy men in the prime of life, The women lived longer, but not happier. They carried the knowledge that death had tasted the Browns now, and death is rarely satisfied with just one course. Sarah Brown remembers the night she first saw her great-grandfather in the kitchen of the family homestead. She was 7 years old, sneaking downstairs for a glass of water, when she found him sitting at the table where he'd eaten his last meal in 1962. He looked exactly as he had in the photograph on the mantelpiece, work clothes stained with coal dust, hands scarred from years in the mines, eyes that held the particular emptiness of a man who'd seen too much darkness underground. "Child," he said, without looking up from the deck of cards he was shuffling with hands that cast no shadow. "You got to tell your daddy to give back what ain't his." Sarah ran back to her room, but she couldn't escape the smell that followed her, the metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with the sulfur stench of mine gas. In the morning, her parents found her windows nailed shut from the inside, though she had no memory of hammering them closed. The Browns had built their fortune on a foundation of theft and murder, though the family Bible made no mention of these particular sins. In 1887, Josiah Brown had discovered a vein of coal that ran beneath his neighbor's property. Instead of negotiating a fair deal, he'd arranged for the neighbor's house to catch fire on a night when the wind was blowing wrong. The neighbor's family, a wife and 3 young children, burned alive while Josiah stood watching from the tree line, already calculating how much the newly vacant land would cost him at auction. The coal made Josiah rich, but coal, like blood, carries memory in its carbon heart. Every ton extracted from that stolen ground carried with it the screams of the murdered family, their ashes mixed with the earth that fed the seam. And when coal burns, it releases more than just heat and light. It releases the past. The Brown family fortune grew with each generation, but so did the hauntings. Josiah's son Walter heard voices in the mine shafts, the crying of children that echoed from tunnels that should have been empty. His grandson Frederick found bloody handprints on the walls of his office, prints that belonged to no living person, but matched the size of the neighbor children who died in the fire. And Frederick's son Daniel began experiencing dreams where he lived through his great-grandfather's crime over and over, feeling the heat of the flames and hearing the screams until he woke up with the taste of smoke in his mouth and ash under his fingernails. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. The sins of Josiah Brown had not died with him. They lived on in his bloodline, passed down like genetic inheritance, growing stronger with each generation that failed to make amends for the original crime. In traditional Jewish theology, the concept of generational punishment is written into the fabric of divine law itself. Exodus 34:7 speaks with terrifying clarity. The Lord, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, and upon the children's children, unto the 3rd and to the 4th generation. This is not metaphor or spiritual allegory. It is a statement of cosmic mechanics as precise as any law of physics. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, writing in the 12th century, documented cases where this principle manifested with mathematical precision. Families that prospered through dishonest means would see their wealth evaporate exactly 3 generations later. Bloodlines stained with innocent blood would produce children born with birth defects that appeared in no medical texts. Communities that turned away strangers would find themselves afflicted with plagues that respected no boundaries except genetic ones. But the most extensive documentation comes from the tradition of Gilgul, the transmigration of souls, which holds that unresolved sins create spiritual debts that must be paid by the sinner's descendants. These debts do not diminish with time or distance. They compound like interest, growing heavier with each generation that fails to acknowledge and rectify the original transgression. The Talmudic scholars who studied these patterns discovered that ancestral guilt operates according to strict rules. The punishment must fit the crime, often manifesting as a mirror image of the original sin. A family that built its fortune on stolen grain would see their crops fail, regardless of weather or soil conditions. A bloodline founded on murder would produce children who died young of inexplicable causes. Most terrifyingly, families guilty of betraying trust would find themselves incapable of maintaining relationships, their descendants doomed to lives of isolation and suspicion. Rabbi Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist of 16th century Saft, taught that these generational curses were not punishment but opportunity, chances for the living to heal wounds inflicted by the dead. But healing required more than acknowledgement. It demanded action that matched the magnitude of the original sin. In the mountains of Japan, where Shinto tradition recognizes the reality of ancestral spirits with scientific precision, the concept of Tatari represents a similar understanding of how the dead continue to influence the living. But Japanese folk wisdom goes further, recognizing that ancestral wrath can be inherited not just through blood, but through proximity. That living on cursed land or inheriting cursed objects can transfer the spiritual debt to innocent parties. The Tanaka family of Gifu Prefecture discovered this truth when they purchased a traditional farmhouse from a family desperate to sell. The price was suspiciously low for such a well-maintained property, but economic necessity overrode caution. Within months of moving in, the Tanakas began experiencing phenomena that defied rational explanation. Their youngest daughter, previously a healthy child, began speaking in voices that belonged to no living person, ancient dialects that she could not possibly have learned. Conversations with invisible companions who seemed to know intimate details about long-dead members of the property's previous owners. She drew pictures that depicted events that had occurred decades before her birth. A man hanging from the rafters of the very room where she now slept. A woman drowning in the well that still provided water to the house. Children buried in the garden under cherry trees that bloomed black flowers instead of pink. Investigation revealed that the previous family had not been the original owners. They had purchased the property from relatives of a man named Ichiro Yamamoto, who had committed suicide in 1943 after murdering his wife and children in a fit of madness brought on by wartime starvation. But Yamamoto's crime was itself the culmination of a curse that traced back 3 generations to his grandfather, who had cheated a neighboring family out of their rice harvest during the famine of 1836. The hungry ghosts of that stolen harvest had waited over a century for justice, growing stronger with each generation that inherited the cursed property. They did not distinguish between Yamamoto's bloodline and the innocent families who later occupied their domain. Guilt, in the economy of ancestral spirits, is a transferable commodity that attaches to places as readily as to people. The Tanakas performed multiple purification rituals, burning incense, making offerings to the ancestors, even hiring a Buddhist priest to conduct formal exorcism ceremonies. But the hauntings only intensified, as if the spirits recognized these gestures as inadequate compensation for decades of accumulated injustice. It was only when the Tanakas traced the original crime and arranged for the stolen rice to be repaid, calculated with interest and inflation over more than a century, that the manifestations began to subside. They purchased rice equivalent to what had been stolen and distributed it to families in the region descended from Yamamoto's victims. They also established a shrine on the property where offerings could be made to the hungry ghosts, acknowledging their suffering and providing a mechanism for ongoing spiritual maintenance. The case of the Yamamoto property illustrates a principle recognized by traditional cultures worldwide: that justice delayed is not justice denied, but justice compounded. The longer a wrong remains unaddressed, the greater the spiritual debt becomes, and the more drastic the measures required to satisfy it. In the forests of the Congo Basin, where the Bakongo people have maintained spiritual traditions for over 1,000 years, the concept of ancestral accountability reaches its most sophisticated expression. The Enkisi, Spiritual entities that enforce cosmic justice recognize no statute of limitations on crimes committed against the community or the natural world. Dr. Kimbwandende Kiya Fu Kiao, the Congolese scholar who documented these traditions before his death in 2001, described cases where colonial-era crimes continue to manifest consequences decades after the original perpetrators had died. Families whose ancestors had collaborated with slave traders found themselves afflicted with diseases that Western medicine could not cure. Communities built on sites where atrocities had occurred experienced patterns of misfortune that followed genetic lines with disturbing precision. The Nkaisi operate according to principles that parallel quantum physics more closely than traditional Western theology. Actions create resonances that persist across time and space, influencing events through mechanisms that appear supernatural only because they operate on scales too large for human perception to grasp directly. Guilt, in this understanding, is not an emotional state, but a physical force that alters the probability matrices governing individual and collective destiny. Fu Kiao documented the case of the Mbemba clan, whose ancestor had betrayed a rival village to Portuguese slavers in 1682. Over the subsequent 3 centuries, the Mbemba bloodline had been marked by a specific pattern of misfortune. Every 3rd generation produced children who died before reaching adulthood, usually from ailments that appeared suddenly and resisted all forms of treatment. Western medical personnel working in the region dismissed these deaths as products of genetic disorders or environmental factors. But Foucault's research revealed that the mortality pattern followed the spiritual laws governing ancestral justice, rather than the biological principles underlying hereditary disease. The deaths occurred precisely when needed to maintain cosmic balance, affecting exactly those family members whose birth order and genealogical position made them spiritually responsible for their ancestors' crime. The curse was finally broken in 1987 when Marcel Mbemba, a university-educated engineer, decided to investigate his family's oral history. Tracing the genealogical connections between the original betrayal and the subsequent deaths, he discovered that the pattern would culminate with his own son, the boy who would represent the end of the bloodline's ability to make amends for their ancestors' crime. Marcel performed a ritual of acknowledgement and restitution that required him to liquidate his considerable assets and distribute the proceeds to communities descended from his ancestors' victims. He also committed his family to 3 generations of service to slave descendant communities, binding his bloodline to actively work against the forms of exploitation that their ancestor had enabled. The ritual worked. Marcel's son survived to adulthood and went on to become a prominent human rights lawyer specializing in cases involving historical injustice. But more importantly, the family began experiencing positive manifestations of ancestral influence, dreams that provided guidance rather than torment, spiritual presences that offered protection rather than punishment. The transformation of the Mbemba curse illustrates a crucial principle. Ancestral guilt can be transmitted into ancestral grace, but only through actions that demonstrate genuine understanding of the original harm and commitment to preventing its repetition. In the tradition of Haitian Vodou, where African spiritual principles merged with Caribbean historical experience, the relationship between ancestors and descendants reaches perhaps its most complex expression. The LWA, spirits that govern various aspects of human experience, include entities that specifically oversee the inheritance of spiritual debts and the mechanisms through which they can be resolved. Papa Legba, the guardian of crossroads and communication between the living and the dead, serves as the primary intermediary for cases involving generational justice. Mambo Marie Laveau, the legendary Vodou priestess of 19th century New Orleans, documented numerous instances where families sought her intervention to address curses inherited from slave-era crimes. The Dufresne plantation family provides one of the most thoroughly documented examples. Jean-Baptiste Dufresne had built his sugar fortune through treatment of enslaved people that was brutal even by the standards of antebellum Louisiana. When his plantation burned in 1857, killing Dufresne and his immediate family, survivors assumed that justice had been served and the matter was closed. But the spiritual mathematics of Vodou do not operate according to Western concepts of proportional justice. Dufresne's crimes had created spiritual debts that could not be cancelled by his death alone. They required acknowledgement and restitution by his surviving bloodline. For 4 generations, the Dufresne descendants experienced a pattern of misfortune that precisely mirrored their ancestors' crimes. Family members died in fires that started without apparent cause. Children born to the bloodline suffered from ailments that resembled the diseases that had killed enslaved people on the original plantation. Most disturbing of all, family members began experiencing vivid dreams where they lived through the suffering their ancestor had inflicted, feeling every lash of the whip and every moment of despair as if it were their own experience. The curse reached its culmination in 1923, when Marie Dufresne, Jean-Baptiste's great-great-granddaughter, sought the help of Mambo Ava K. Jones, a Vodou priestess who specialized in cases involving ancestral justice. Through divination and communication with the LWA, Jones determined that the curse could only be broken through a ritual that acknowledged the full scope of Jean-Baptiste's crimes and provided meaningful compensation to the spiritual community of his victims. The ritual required Marie to liquidate her family's remaining assets and establish a foundation dedicated to supporting descendants of enslaved people. She also committed herself and her bloodline to 7 generations of service to the African American community, binding her family's future to the work of healing the wounds that slavery had inflicted on both perpetrators and victims. But the most powerful aspect of the ritual involved direct communication with the spirits of Jean-Baptiste's victims. Through possession and trance states, Marie experienced their suffering firsthand, allowing their pain to flow through her consciousness until she understood not just the magnitude of their ancestors' crimes, but the full extent of the healing that justice required. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Family members who had suffered from chronic ailments found themselves suddenly healthy. Business ventures that had consistently failed began to prosper. Most importantly, the nightmares that had plagued the bloodline for generations gave way to dreams where ancestral spirits offered guidance and protection. The Dufresne case demonstrates that ancestral guilt operates as a form of spiritual ecology, a system where actions create consequences that must be balanced through equivalent responses, but where the equation can be resolved through genuine acknowledgement and meaningful restitution. Modern psychology has begun to recognize patterns that parallel these traditional understandings of generational trauma. Research into epigenetic inheritance has revealed that traumatic experiences can create biological changes that are passed to subsequent generations through mechanisms that operate at the cellular level. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking studies of Holocaust survivors and their descendants have documented how trauma creates genetic modifications that affect stress response, immune function, and neurological development in ways that persist across multiple generations. Children and grandchildren of trauma survivors display biological markers associated with stress disorders, even when they have not experienced trauma themselves. But the clinical language of modern psychology cannot capture the full scope of what traditional cultures have always understood: that some wounds go deeper than individual consciousness, creating spiritual debts that require communal healing rather than individual therapy. The work of Dr. Joy DeGruy on post-traumatic slave syndrome has begun to bridge this gap, documenting how the unresolved trauma of slavery continues to manifest in African American communities through patterns that mirror the ancestral curses described in traditional spiritual systems. Her research reveals that healing these generational wounds requires not just individual therapy, but collective acknowledgement of historical injustice and commitment to systemic change. In the mountains of Tibet, where Buddhist understanding of karma provides perhaps the most sophisticated framework for understanding generational consequence, the concept of inherited spiritual debt reaches its most nuanced expression. The Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes how unresolved actions create karmic debts that bind consciousness to cycles of suffering until they are fully acknowledged and resolved. Tibetan medicine recognizes specific ailments that result from inherited karmic debt, conditions that cannot be cured through conventional treatment, but require spiritual intervention that addresses the original cause of the imbalance. These Ayalung disorders affect the subtle energy systems that connect consciousness to the physical body, creating symptoms that manifest as depression, anxiety, and chronic pain, but stem from spiritual sources that may be generations old. The Dalai Lama himself has spoken of cases where children are born carrying the karmic debts of previous incarnations, inheriting spiritual obligations that must be fulfilled before the consciousness can progress to higher states of development. These children often display knowledge and abilities that cannot be explained through normal inheritance, remembering details about lives they never lived, and carrying emotional burdens that belong to experiences that predate their birth. But Tibetan tradition also provides the most hopeful understanding of how generational curses can be transformed into generational blessings. Through practices of Tonglen, taking and giving, individuals can consciously accept the suffering created by ancestral actions and transform it through compassionate intention and skillful action. The practice requires practitioners to fully acknowledge the harm created by their ancestors, while committing themselves to actions that prevent similar suffering in the future. It is not enough to feel sorry for past wrongs. The practitioner must take responsibility for healing the wounds that those wrongs created and ensuring that they are not perpetuated in future generations. This understanding transforms ancestral guilt from a burden to be escaped into an opportunity for spiritual development. The karma inherited from previous generations becomes raw material for compassionate action, a chance to demonstrate that consciousness can evolve beyond the patterns that created suffering in the past. In this view, those who inherit the heaviest karmic debts are actually receiving the greatest spiritual opportunities, chances to accumulate merit through actions that heal not just their own consciousness, but the entire web of relationships that their ancestors damaged through ignorance and selfishness. The principle operates across cultures and religious traditions with remarkable consistency. The sins of the fathers are visited upon the children not as punishment, but as opportunity, chances for the living to complete the spiritual work that the dead left unfinished. But the opportunity comes with a price. Those who inherit ancestral guilt must choose between perpetuating the patterns that created it or accepting responsibility for healing wounds they did not create. The choice determines not just their own destiny, but the spiritual inheritance they will pass to their own descendants. In the end, every family tree grows from soil fertilized with the consequences of ancestral actions. Some bloodlines inherit gardens of blessing, while others inherit fields of thorns. But in both cases, the inheritance includes the power to choose what grows in the next generation. The dead cannot change their actions, but the living can choose how those actions will be remembered, what lessons will be learned from them, and what legacy will be passed to the children who have not yet been born. The sins of the fathers need not become the sins of the children. But breaking the chain requires more than good intentions. It demands the courage to face the full truth of what came before, and the commitment to ensure that justice, delayed for generations, finally finds its way home. The infant is born with a caul over her face, that thin membrane of flesh that midwives know to fear. In the flickering candlelight of the birthing chamber, the translucent veil seems to pulse with its own rhythm, as if something beneath is trying to breathe through skin that was never meant to cover a human mouth. The attending women cross themselves and whisper prayers, but they do not remove the caul immediately. They know what it means when a child enters the world already wearing a shroud. This is how the cunning folk are born. This is how the bloodlines of power announce themselves to a world that has forgotten how to listen. Agnes Waterhouse feels the knowledge flowing through her veins like poison the moment her daughter draws her first breath. She has never read the Malleus Maleficarum, that encyclopedia of feminine damnation penned by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger in 1487, but her blood carries truths that their inquisitor minds could never comprehend. The power does not come from pacts with devils or midnight rituals in moonlit groves. It comes from inheritance, from genetic memories that stretch back through maternal lines to times when the distinction between sacred and profane had not yet been carved in stone by patriarchal theology. The Malleus speaks with certainty about how witchcraft passes from mother to daughter. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. Therefore, it is no wonder that so great a number of witches exist in this sex. But the authors, in their theological arrogance, mistake effect for cause. They see the manifestation of power and assume it springs from moral corruption, never understanding that they are documenting the hereditary expression of abilities that predate Christianity by millennia. In the parish records of Hatfield Peveril, Essex, the Waterhouse name appears with suspicious frequency. Agnes's grandmother, Joan, was accused of causing the death of a neighbour's cow through malevolent glances. Her great-grandmother, Mary, was said to possess the ability to cure wasting sickness in children, but only children whose parents could afford her fees. And her great-great-grandmother, whose name the church scribes recorded only as the Old Woman, was burned at Chelmsford in 1566 for the crime of knowing too much about the movements of the seasons and the secret names of growing things. But the power did not die with the old woman's ashes. It flowed underground, through bloodlines that learned to hide their nature beneath layers of Christian piety and domestic servitude. The cunning women of Essex developed elaborate codes for passing knowledge from mother to daughter. Herb lore disguised as cooking recipes, incantations embedded in children's lullabies, rituals hidden within the seemingly innocent customs of rural housekeeping. Agnes learns these codes at her own mother's knee, absorbing knowledge that has never been written down because writing makes power vulnerable to those who would destroy it. She learns to read the future in the patterns of tea leaves and the formation of clouds. She discovers that her touch can heal some ailments while worsening others, and that the difference depends not on the illness, but on the spiritual debt carried by the patient. Most importantly, she learns that the power growing in her blood will grow stronger in her daughter's veins, and stronger still in her daughter's daughter, until it reaches a concentration that will demand acknowledgement from a world that has spent centuries trying to forget that such abilities exist. The trial of Agnes Waterhouse in 1566 provides the clearest documentation of how hereditary witchcraft manifests across generations. The court records, preserved in the Essex County Archives, detail not just the accusations against Agnes, but the testimonies that reveal a family tradition of supernatural ability stretching back beyond living memory. Witness after witness describes incidents that follow patterns too consistent to be coincidence. The Waterhouse women possess the ability to communicate with animals in ways that transcend normal training methods. Their gardens produce crops that thrive despite poor soil and harsh weather. Children born to their bloodline display precocious intelligence and uncanny intuitive abilities. Most disturbing to the Christian authorities, they demonstrate knowledge of future events that proves accurate, with uncomfortable frequency. But the trial records also reveal something that the Malleus Maleficarum never acknowledges. The power carries a price that grows heavier with each generation. Agnes's mother died young. Her hair turned white before her 40th birthday. Her grandmother suffered from visions that drove her to periods of madness, during which she would speak in languages that scholars could not identify. Her great-grandmother was found dead in her garden on the summer solstice, her body showing no signs of injury, but positioned in a pattern that local clergy recognized as significant, though they dared not record its meaning. The hereditary nature of witchcraft creates a cruel paradox. Each generation inherits greater power than the last, but also greater vulnerability to the forces that such power attracts. The women of the Waterhouse line do not choose their abilities. They are chosen by them, selected by genetic lottery to serve as vessels for energies that human consciousness was never designed to contain. When Agnes is finally condemned and executed, her last words are not a confession or a plea for mercy, but a warning directed at her daughter, who watches from the crowd with eyes that already hold too much knowledge for a child her age. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. Let it sleep until it must wake. But blood, like water, follows its own currents. And the Waterhouse line does not end with Agnes's ashes. In the Scottish Highlands, where clan loyalty runs deeper than Christian doctrine and the old ways survive in the shadows of newer faiths, the MacLeod family has maintained its traditions of hereditary second sight for over 8 centuries. Unlike the persecuted cunning folk of England, the MacLeod seers have never hidden their abilities. They serve as advisors to clan chiefs, warning of battles that have not yet been fought and deaths that have not yet occurred. The MacLeod gift follows strict patterns of inheritance that violate every principle of Mendelian genetics while displaying consistency that would impress any statistician. The ability manifests only in women, appears only in every 3rd generation, and always emerges on the child's 7th birthday through dreams that prove prophetically accurate. Flora MacLeod, writing in her private journal in 1745, describes the experience of inheriting the sight. It comes like fever, burning through the blood until the very bones seem to glow with heat, and then the world splits open like an overripe fruit, revealing layers that were always there but hidden from ordinary sight. Past and future exist simultaneously, connected by threads of causation that span generations. The MacLeod records, maintained in a combination of Gaelic and medieval Latin, document specific instances where the family's prophetic abilities saved entire communities from disaster. In 1314, Morag MacLeod warned her clan to avoid the battlefield at Bannockburn 3 days before Robert the Bruce's army arrived in the area. In 1692, Fiona MacLeod prevented the massacre that befell the MacDonalds of Glencoe by providing advance warning that allowed most of the clan to escape before government troops arrived. But the MacLeod gift exacts its own price. Women who possess the sight age rapidly during periods of intense prophetic activity, their hair turning white, and their skin developing a translucent quality that makes them appear ghostly even in bright sunlight. More troubling, they often die at the moment when their most important prophecy comes to pass, as if the effort of channeling divine knowledge burns through their mortal vessel, like acid through cloth. The MacLeod tradition recognizes this sacrifice as necessary, a price paid by individual women to preserve the spiritual welfare of the entire clan. But the genetic records maintained by the family reveal a disturbing pattern. Each generation's seers are more powerful than their predecessors, but their lifespans grow correspondingly shorter. The gift is evolving, becoming more concentrated and more deadly with each passing century. Dr. Margaret MacLeod, the current keeper of the family records and a professor of genetics at the University of Edinburgh, speaks carefully when asked about her heritage. Her scientific training conflicts with the evidence contained in her own genealogical documents, creating a cognitive dissonance that she resolves through meticulous documentation rather than explanation. There are genetic markers in our bloodline that don't appear in standard medical literature, she admits during a private interview. Neurological structures that seem to facilitate forms of perception that current science doesn't recognize as possible. The family has participated in several studies, but the results are always classified or suppressed. Apparently, there are some forms of human evolution that academic institutions prefer not to acknowledge. The suppression of research into hereditary psychic abilities reflects a broader pattern of institutional denial that has characterized Western responses to supernatural inheritance for centuries. Government agencies, religious authorities, and academic institutions have consistently collaborated to suppress evidence that some human bloodlines possess capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and reality. In 1952, the CIA established Project STARGATE to investigate claims of psychic abilities for potential military applications. Declassified documents reveal that the program identified several families whose members demonstrated measurable extrasensory perception across multiple generations. But rather than publishing these findings, the agency quietly recruited the most promising individuals while suppressing research that might reveal the hereditary nature of their abilities. Dr. Jessica Utz, the statistician who conducted the official evaluation of Stargate results, confirmed that certain families produced psychic subjects with statistical reliability that exceeded chance by margins that conventional science could not explain. The data clearly indicated genetic factors, she noted in a classified addendum to her public report. But the implications were considered too destabilizing for public release. The families identified through Stargate testing displayed characteristics that matched historical descriptions of hereditary witchcraft, enhanced intuitive abilities, unusual sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and neurological differences that appeared to facilitate forms of perception beyond the normal sensory range. Most significantly, these abilities consistently appeared in specific bloodlines, following inheritance patterns that suggested genetic rather than environmental causation. But the government's interest in these families extended beyond their psychic abilities. Classified medical examinations revealed that hereditary psychics displayed unusual longevity, enhanced immune function, and resistance to certain forms of mental illness. Their blood chemistry included compounds that did not appear in normal human physiology, and their brain scans showed activity patterns that seemed to indicate access to information sources that conventional neuroscience could not identify. The French Archives Nationales contain records that reveal similar patterns of government interest in hereditary witchcraft during the reign of Louis XIV Cardinal Mazarin, commissioned secret investigations into families accused of sorcery, not to prosecute them, but to identify bloodlines that might be useful to state interests. The investigations, conducted by Jesuit scholars trained in both theology and natural philosophy, produced reports that read like modern genetic studies. They documented families where psychic abilities appeared with predictable frequency, where knowledge seemed to pass from generation to generation through mechanisms that exceeded normal learning, and where individual members displayed capabilities that could be weaponized for political purposes. Marie de Montespan, Louis XIV's most influential mistress, came from a bloodline that had been investigated by Mazarin's agents. The Rochechouart family had produced seers and healers for over 4 centuries, women whose abilities were so well known that they served European royalty as unofficial advisors and court physicians. Marie's influence over the Sun King was not merely sexual or romantic. She possessed inherited abilities that allowed her to anticipate his needs and manipulate his emotions with supernatural precision. But Marie's power also carried the hereditary curse that afflicted all bloodlines marked by supernatural ability. Her children by Louis XIV were born with physical and mental abnormalities that royal physicians could not explain. Her daughter, Louise Françoise, suffered from seizures during which she would speak in voices that belonged to long-dead members of the Rochechouart line. Her son, Louis Auguste, displayed intelligence that exceeded normal human parameters, but was subject to fits of rage that required physical restraint to prevent him from harming himself and others. The pattern repeated itself in subsequent generations of the legitimized royal bastards. The children inherited both their mother's psychic abilities and the genetic instabilities that accompanied them. Palace physicians documented cases of spontaneous combustion, levitation, and communication with deceased spirits, phenomena that they attributed to divine intervention rather than acknowledging their hereditary nature. When Marie finally fell from favor and was exiled from court, it was not because Louis XIV had tired of her beauty or political ambitions. It was because her bloodline's hereditary curse had begun to manifest in ways that threatened the stability of the monarchy itself. Her psychic abilities, enhanced by generations of concentrated breeding, had reached a level of intensity that made her presence at court dangerous to anyone who opposed her will. The Spanish Inquisition's investigations into brujeria provide the most extensive documentation of how hereditary witchcraft was perceived and persecuted during the early modern period. Unlike their northern European counterparts, Spanish inquisitors maintained detailed genealogical records that traced suspected bloodlines across multiple generations, creating family trees of supernatural ability that rival modern genetic studies in their thoroughness. The archive of the Tribunal del Santo Oficio in Toledo contains files on over 3,000 families investigated for hereditary witchcraft between 1478 and 1834. These records reveal patterns that contradict official theological explanations while providing clear evidence of genetic inheritance of psychic abilities. The Mendoza family of Castile exemplifies these patterns. For 6 generations, Mendoza women were accused of possessing the ability to influence weather patterns through ritual means. Church investigators documented numerous instances where family members apparently summoned rain during droughts or calmed storms that threatened agricultural areas. More troubling to Catholic authorities, the Mendoza women seemed immune to traditional forms of religious intervention. Holy water caused them physical pain, blessed crosses cracked when they touched them, and Church Latin made them speak in tongues. But the Inquisition records also document the price paid by hereditary witches for their abilities. Mendoza women aged rapidly, often appearing decades older than their chronological age by their 40th birthdays. They suffered from chronic ailments that resembled autoimmune disorders, as if their own bodies were rejecting the supernatural energies they channeled. Most died young, typically during childbirth or shortly after passing their abilities to the next generation. Inquisitor Francisco de Bobadilla, writing in 1547, noted patterns that modern genetics would recognize as evidence of hereditary genetic disorders. The daughters of witches bear the mark of their mother's sins in their very flesh. They are born with fingers that number 6 rather than 5, eyes that reflect light like the eyes of beasts, and blood that runs black beneath skin pale as winter snow. But Bobadilla's theological interpretation missed the crucial point. These physical anomalies were not divine punishment, but evolutionary adaptation. The bloodlines accused of witchcraft were developing genetic modifications that enhanced their psychic abilities, while exacting a biological price that grew heavier with each generation. Modern medical analysis of remains from Inquisition victims has confirmed Bobadilla's observations, while providing scientific explanations that he could never have imagined. DNA extracted from bones found in mass graves reveals genetic sequences that do not appear in normal human populations. Modifications that affect neurotransmitter production, electromagnetic sensitivity, and cellular energy metabolism in ways that could theoretically support enhanced psychic abilities. Dr. Carlos Vega, the forensic anthropologist who conducted these analyses, published his findings in carefully neutral language that avoids direct claims about supernatural inheritance. The subjects display genetic variations that affect neurological function in ways that current medical science cannot fully explain. These variations follow clear hereditary patterns and appear to be connected to enhanced sensory capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters. But Vega's private correspondence, obtained through academic colleagues, reveals his true assessment of the evidence. We are looking at a subspecies, a branch of human evolution that developed along completely different lines from the mainstream population. They were not witches in any supernatural sense. They were something much more troubling. They were the next stage of human development, and we killed them because we were afraid of what they represented. The persecution of hereditary witches during the early modern period was not merely religious zealotry or patriarchal oppression, it was evolutionary warfare. The bloodlines that carried psychic abilities represented a genetic threat to normal human dominance, a challenge to the assumption that Homo sapiens was the final expression of human evolution. The witch trials served as a mechanism for identifying and eliminating genetic variants that might have eventually replaced the normal human population. They were eugenic programs disguised as religious persecution, designed to preserve the genetic status quo by eliminating bloodlines that carried traits incompatible with conventional human society. But evolution is not so easily suppressed. The genes that powered hereditary witchcraft did not disappear with the burning times. They went underground, scattered through populations that learned to hide their nature beneath layers of conformity and deliberate mediocrity. In the genetic databases that now map human heredity with unprecedented precision, researchers are beginning to identify the scattered remnants of these ancient bloodlines. Families that display unusual longevity, enhanced intuitive abilities, and resistance to certain forms of mental illness often carry genetic markers that can be traced back to populations that suffered disproportionate persecution during the witch trials. Dr. Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, the evolutionary anthropologist whose work on cooperative breeding revolutionized understanding of human social development, has identified genetic variants that appear in families with documented histories of psychic abilities. These variants affect neural development in ways that could theoretically support enhanced pattern recognition and information processing, she notes in a recent paper. They represent a form of human diversity that we are only beginning to understand. But Hrdy's research also reveals the continuing price paid by hereditary psychics. The genetic modifications that enhance their abilities also increase their vulnerability to autoimmune disorders, neurological instabilities, and reproductive difficulties. The bloodlines that survived the witch trials carry genes that grant extraordinary capabilities while exacting extraordinary costs. The modern world has found new ways to identify and suppress hereditary witchcraft. Pharmaceutical intervention can modify brain chemistry to suppress psychic abilities. Electromagnetic pollution disrupts the environmental conditions that psychic abilities require to function effectively. Most importantly, genetic counseling can identify couples at risk of producing psychically gifted children and recommend reproductive choices that would eliminate such traits from future generations. The persecution continues, but it wears the face of medical science rather than religious authority. The witch's blood flows in scattered veins, growing weaker with each generation that chooses normalcy over the terrible gift of power. But power, like blood, has its own currents, and sometimes those currents converge in ways that no amount of suppression can prevent. In certain bloodlines, the ancient abilities are growing stronger again. Children are being born with capabilities that their parents cannot understand or control. Families are discovering that the gift skipped generations, hiding in recessive genes that suddenly express themselves in ways that shatter the comfortable illusion that such things belong only to the past. The witch's blood remembers what the world has forgotten, and memory, once awakened, demands acknowledgement from a reality that has spent centuries trying to pretend that magic died with the last burned witch. But magic does not die. It simply waits for the right vessel to carry it forward into a future that has not yet learned to fear what it cannot control. The blood always remembers, and the blood always finds a way. The house on Elm Street has stood empty for 3 years, but the neighbors still cross themselves when they pass its iron gates. Not because they believe in ghosts, this is 1987, and suburban Connecticut has moved beyond such superstitions, but because the mathematics of tragedy have reached a saturation point that even skeptical minds cannot ignore. 4 families have lived in the Blackwood mansion since its construction in 1923. 4 families have fled, leaving behind furniture, photographs, and children's toys as if death itself had whispered evacuation orders in the middle of ordinary Tuesday afternoons. The real estate agents no longer mention the house's history in their listings, but history has a way of announcing itself regardless of professional discretion. The Hendersons lasted 18 months. Thomas Henderson, a bank president who had never shown signs of mental illness, was found in the mansion's library with his wrists opened by paper cuts that numbered in the thousands. Tiny wounds inflicted by pages torn from books that contain nothing more sinister than Victorian poetry. His wife, Margaret, survived, but only in the technical sense. She spoke of voices that called to her from the walls themselves, conversations that grew louder each night until she could no longer distinguish between the living and the dead. The Yamadas lasted 11 months. Kenji Yamada, a computer engineer whose logical mind had no room for supernatural explanations, documented his family's experiences with scientific precision until the night he walked into Boston Harbor wearing a suit of armor cobbled together from kitchen pots and medieval reproductions. His suicide note, written in binary code, translated to a single repeated phrase: "The house remembers everything." The Kowalskis lasted 7 months. Anna Kowalski, a pediatric nurse whose profession required her to comfort frightened children, began speaking to invisible playmates that her own daughters insisted were not imaginary. When Child Protective Services investigated reports of neglect, they found the Kowalski children healthy and well cared for, but speaking fluent Latin despite never having been exposed to the language. The family left on a Tuesday morning and never returned for their belongings. The Patels lasted 3 months. Rajesh Patel, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma therapy, approached the house as a professional challenge, an opportunity to apply scientific methodology to allegedly paranormal phenomena. His clinical notes, found scattered throughout the mansion after his family's hasty departure, chart the systematic dissolution of a rational mind confronted with evidence that violated every principle of his training. The final entry, written in Sanskrit, despite Patel's limited knowledge of the language, describes a revelation that he claims would destroy the illusion of individual consciousness and reveal the truth of inherited memory. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, too specific to be explained by suggestion or environmental factors. Each family experiences the same progression: initial skepticism, followed by isolated incidents, growing manifestations that target the family's particular vulnerabilities, and finally a revelation that drives them from the house with the urgency of people fleeing a burning building. But the Blackwood mansion was not built on cursed ground or haunted soil. It was constructed by architect Samuel Blackwood using stones quarried from his family's ancestral estate in Yorkshire. Stones that carried within their limestone matrix the accumulated psychic residue of 8 centuries of Blackwood tragedies. The old traditions speak of genius loci, the spirit of place, operating according to principles that modern architecture ignores at its peril. Buildings are not merely physical structures, but repositories of emotional energy, collecting and concentrating the experiences of everyone who has ever lived within their walls. Most houses accumulate benign psychic residue, the gentle ghosts of ordinary joys and sorrows that give old homes their particular character. But some families bring more than furniture and photographs to their new homes. They bring histories that weigh heavier than physical possessions, bloodlines that carry spiritual debts accumulated over generations, and genetic memories that transform innocent spaces into echo chambers of ancestral trauma. Samuel Blackwood inherited more than money when his father died in 1922. He inherited a family legacy that stretched back to the Norman conquest, a bloodline that had accumulated wealth through methods that violated both human law and cosmic justice. The Blackwoods had risen to prominence by betraying their feudal lords during the Wars of the Roses, had maintained their estates through witch trials that eliminated inconvenient neighbours, and had expanded their holdings during the Irish famines by purchasing land from families too desperate to negotiate fair prices. Each generation of Blackwoods had prospered through the suffering of others, and that suffering had accumulated in the family's ancestral seat like sediment in a riverbed. When Samuel transported the stones of that estate to Connecticut, he was not merely importing building materials. He was transplanting the concentrated psychic residue of 8 centuries of exploitation and betrayal. The new house became a beacon for the unquiet dead, a lodestone that attracted the spirits of everyone who had suffered at Blackwood hands. The limestone walls contained actual traces of ashes from burned witches, soil from unmarked graves, and mortar mixed with tears shed by families destroyed through Blackwood avarice. The house itself became a physical manifestation of generational guilt, a structure that existed as much in the spiritual realm as in the material world. But the Blackwood curse followed patterns that extended beyond individual family history. The house operated according to folkloric rules that have been documented across cultures. Primogeniture laws that concentrate both wealth and spiritual debt in the firstborn child. Birth order superstitions that assign specific roles to each family member, and inheritance patterns that ensure the most sensitive individuals bear the heaviest burden of ancestral guilt. The families who fled the Blackwood mansion all shared certain characteristics that made them particularly susceptible to the house's influence. They were successful professionals whose careers required high levels of stress tolerance, parents who had devoted their lives to protecting and nurturing others, and individuals whose moral frameworks provided no explanation for the forms of evil they encountered within the mansion's walls. The house targeted their specific virtues, transforming their greatest strengths into vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile spiritual forces. Thomas Henderson's financial acumen became an obsession with counting and measuring that drove him to inflict thousands of precise wounds on his own flesh. Margaret Henderson's maternal instincts became a compulsion to nurture invisible children whose needs could never be satisfied. Kenji Yamada's logical mind became trapped in recursive loops of data processing that concluded with the necessity of his own death. Anna Kowalski's ability to comfort frightened children became a channel through which dead children could communicate their terror and rage. Rajesh Patel's therapeutic training became a vulnerability that allowed traumatized spirits to overwhelm his consciousness with experiences he was professionally obligated to witness and understand. The pattern suggests that certain houses function as spiritual predators, entities that feed on the emotional energy of their inhabitants while growing stronger with each family they consume. These structures develop their own malevolent intelligence over time, learning to identify and exploit the particular weaknesses of each new set of victims. The Blackwood Mansion represents the most sophisticated example of architectural vampirism ever documented in North America, but similar cases have been recorded throughout the world wherever wealth accumulates through morally questionable means. The Chateau of Gilles de Rais in France, the palaces of Vlad the Impaler in Romania, and the plantation houses of the antebellum South all display characteristics that match the Blackwood pattern. These structures share certain architectural features that seem to facilitate supernatural manifestation. Extensive use of stone quarried from sites with violent histories, construction techniques that create acoustic properties allowing for supernatural communication, and floor plans that reflect occult geometries rather than practical considerations. Most importantly, they were built by families whose wealth derived from exploitation, creating structures that embody the spiritual contradictions inherent in prosperity, built on others' suffering. In Essex, the Borley Rectory presents perhaps the most thoroughly documented case of architectural haunting in European history. Built on the site of a medieval monastery where Benedictine monks were executed for heresy, the rectory displayed supernatural phenomena that correlated directly with the spiritual history of the site and the psychological vulnerabilities of its inhabitants. The investigations revealed that the rectory's manifestations followed specific rules that reflected both the building's history and the moral character of its occupants. Religious families experienced benevolent phenomena, mysterious organ music, apparitions of praying monks, and scents of incense that created feelings of peace and reverence. But secular families encountered hostile manifestations that drove them from the building within months of taking residence. The rectory seemed to function as a spiritual testing ground, a place where the dead evaluated the living and found most of them wanting. Families who demonstrated genuine religious devotion were welcomed and protected, while those who approached the building as merely a place of residence encountered increasingly violent supernatural opposition. But the most disturbing aspect of the Borley case was the evidence that the building itself was evolving, learning from each family that occupied it and developing more sophisticated methods of spiritual manipulation. Early manifestations were crude: wrappings, cold spots, and occasional glimpses of shadowy figures. But by the 1930s, the rectory was producing phenomena that suggested genuine intelligence: messages written in unknown languages, complex musical compositions that emerged from thin air, and prophetic statements that proved accurate years after they were recorded. The building had become more than haunted. It had become intelligent, and its intelligence was focused on a single goal: finding occupants worthy of the spiritual legacy left by the executed monks. In the American South, plantation houses present the most concentrated examples of architectural guilt. Structures built with slave labor and maintained through systems of exploitation that created spiritual debts too massive for individual consciousness to process. These buildings carry the accumulated suffering of generations within their very foundations, creating environments where the boundary between past and present becomes dangerously thin. The Myrtles plantation in Louisiana exemplifies the patterns found throughout the former Confederacy. Built in 1796 by General David Bradford, the house was constructed using labor provided by enslaved Africans whose suffering was literally incorporated into the building's physical structure. The bricks were made from clay, mixed with tears, sweat, and blood. The mortar contained ash from human bones. The wooden beams bore carved symbols that scholars recognize as protective wards created by enslaved practitioners of traditional African religions. But these protective measures could not shield the house from the consequences of its own construction. The Myrtles became a repository for the accumulated trauma of everyone who suffered within its walls. A spiritual prison where the dead remained chained by bonds stronger than any physical restraint. The manifestations at the Myrtles follow patterns that reflect the specific nature of its historical trauma. Visitors report encounters with apparitions of enslaved children who died from diseases that could have been easily treated if they had been considered fully human. Photographers capture images of figures in chains that appear in reflections but not in direct sight. Most disturbing of all, guests experience spontaneous memories of lives they never lived, walking through the house and suddenly understanding the layout from the perspective of people who knew every hidden passage and secret room because they had cleaned and maintained them under threat of violence. The house functions as a repository of genetic memory, a place where the accumulated experiences of the enslaved remain accessible to anyone whose consciousness is sufficiently open to receive them. This creates a form of involuntary time travel that forces visitors to experience historical trauma from the perspective of its victims, providing education in empathy that many find too intense to endure. Modern understanding has begun to recognize patterns that parallel these folkloric insights into architectural memory. Environmental research has demonstrated that physical spaces retain emotional imprints that affect the behavior and mental state of subsequent occupants. Buildings associated with trauma consistently produce higher rates of anxiety, depression, and stress-related illness among their inhabitants. Studies of behavior settings have demonstrated that certain locations consistently produce specific emotional and behavioral responses, regardless of the individuals who occupy them. The truth lies somewhere between scientific materialism and supernatural speculation. Buildings do inherit characteristics from their occupants, but the mechanisms involved operate at levels that current science cannot measure or explain. The accumulated emotional energy of human experience creates fields that persist in physical space long after the individuals who generated them have died. These fields interact with the consciousness of new occupants in ways that can trigger everything from mild unease to full psychotic episodes, depending on the intensity of the residual energy and the sensitivity of the individuals exposed to it. The concept of primogeniture, the inheritance system that concentrates family wealth in the eldest child, creates additional layers of complexity in cases involving cursed properties. Houses that pass from generation to generation within the same bloodline become repositories, not just for the accumulated guilt of individual families, but for the concentrated spiritual debt of entire dynastic lines. These inherited properties function as spiritual debt collectors, extracting payment from each generation until the accumulated guilt is finally resolved or the bloodline is extinguished entirely. The firstborn children who inherit such properties bear the full weight of ancestral sin while being granted the power and wealth necessary to make amends if they possess the wisdom and courage to recognize what is required of them. But power corrupts, and inherited power corrupts in ways that echo across generations. Children who grow up expecting to inherit vast wealth and social position rarely develop the humility necessary to acknowledge their family's crimes or the determination required to make meaningful restitution. Instead, they tend to view their inheritance as a reward for superior genetics, rather than recognizing it as a spiritual debt that demands payment. This creates a cycle where each generation adds to the accumulated guilt rather than resolving it, ensuring that the family's properties become increasingly haunted and unstable with each passing decade. The houses themselves become patient predators, waiting for an heir who will finally acknowledge the truth of their inheritance and take the actions necessary to break the cycle of exploitation and retribution. In rare cases, such acknowledgement occurs. Families discover the true cost of their prosperity and choose to liquidate their holdings, distributing the proceeds to the descendants of their ancestors' victims while dedicating themselves to forms of service that provide restitution rather than profit. When this happens, the supernatural manifestations cease almost immediately. Houses that have been haunted for centuries become peaceful overnight. Properties that no family could occupy for more than a few months become welcoming homes where children play safely and parents sleep soundly. The transformation demonstrates that architectural haunting is not an inevitable consequence of violent history, but a correctable condition that responds to genuine acknowledgement and meaningful restitution. The dead do not seek revenge, they seek justice. And when justice is finally served, they rest. But such transformations are rare. Most inherited properties remain trapped in cycles of supernatural violence that will continue until either the bloodline ends or someone finally finds the courage to break the chain of exploitation that created the haunting in the first place. The houses wait with the patience of stone and the memory of blood. They remember every life lived within their walls, every death that occurred beneath their roofs, every tear shed on their floors. And they will continue to remember until someone finally listens to what they are trying to say. Because in the end, haunted houses are not prisons for the dead. They are museums of unresolved guilt, libraries of accumulated trauma, and schools where the living can learn what their ancestors refused to acknowledge. The architecture remembers what the architects forgot, and memory, once awakened, demands acknowledgement from a world that would prefer to build new foundations rather than repair the old ones. But some foundations run too deep to abandon. Some houses contain too much history to demolish, and some families carry too much guilt to escape through simple relocation. The Gothic inheritance passes from generation to generation like genetic memory, and the houses that embody it stand as monuments to the truth that wealth built on suffering will always carry the weight of what it cost to acquire. The stones remember everything, and they will not let anyone forget. The courthouse clerk in Baton Rouge looks up from her computer screen with practiced indifference as another young woman approaches the name change window. 23 years old, college educated, the kind of person who should have better things to do than reinvent her identity on a Tuesday afternoon. But there's something in her eyes that makes the clerk pay attention, a desperation that speaks of running from something more substantial than an abusive ex-husband or embarrassing credit history. "I need to change my name," the woman says, sliding the paperwork across the counter with hands that shake despite her obvious efforts at composure. Complete legal name change. First, middle, last. Everything. The clerk has processed thousands of these requests, but she's never seen someone try to erase their identity so thoroughly. Most people want to modify a first name or escape a married surname. This woman wants to become someone else entirely, as if her current name carries a contagion that only total transformation can cure. Reason for the change? The clerk asks, though the legal form requires no justification beyond the applicant's desire for a new identity. The woman hesitates, her fingers drumming against the counter in a rhythm that sounds almost like prayer. "Family reasons," she finally answers, and something in her voice makes the clerk decide not to ask for details. Marie-Claire Boudreau, soon to be Sarah Jennifer Walsh, is the latest in a long line of people who have discovered that some inheritances are too dangerous to accept. Her great-great-grandmother, Evangeline Boudreau, was a mambo in 19th century New Orleans whose spiritual practice involved trafficking with entities that demanded payment in blood and suffering. The family had prospered for 5 generations through this supernatural patronage, accumulating wealth and influence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing decade. But prosperity bought with otherworldly currency always comes with hidden costs. The Boudreau bloodline had been paying interest on their ancestors' bargains for over a century, watching as family members died young from inexplicable illnesses, suffered through relationships that ended in violence and betrayal, and gave birth to children who seemed to attract misfortune, like lightning rods drawing electricity from storm clouds. Marie-Claire had tried everything else first. Therapy sessions with psychiatrists who could not explain why her family's tragedies followed such precise patterns. Genetic counseling that revealed no medical basis for the hereditary ailments that plagued her relatives. Even consultations with contemporary practitioners of voodoo who confirmed her suspicions about her inheritance, but offered no practical solutions for escaping it. The name change represents her final attempt at severing the spiritual cords that bind her to 5 generations of accumulated supernatural debt. She has researched the folklore extensively, studying cases from across the world where individuals successfully escaped family curses through the simple expedient of becoming someone else entirely. But escape is never as simple as legal paperwork suggests. The Irish traditions speak of Jeas, curses that bind individuals to specific fates through supernatural compulsion, recognizing that some spiritual obligations transcend legal identity. Traditional methods for breaking a Geas require more than changing one's name. They demand fundamental transformation of the individual's relationship to their ancestral heritage. Seamus O'Brien discovered this truth when he attempted to escape the family curse that had plagued the O'Brien clan for 8 centuries. His ancestors had betrayed Brian Boru at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, accepting payment from Viking invaders to provide intelligence about Irish military preparations. The betrayal had earned them wealth and land, but it had also earned them the enmity of the High King's Druids, who pronounced a Geas that would ensure no O'Brien would ever know peace until the debt was paid in full. For 33 generations, the O'Brien bloodline had produced children who died in wars they did not start, suffered through fortunes that crumbled at the moment of greatest success, and watched their descendants repeat the same patterns of betrayal and retribution that had defined their family since the Norman invasion of Ireland. Seamus had emigrated to Boston in 1847, fleeing both the potato famine and the family reputation that made him unemployable in County Cork. He legally changed his name to Samuel O'Brien, altering the spelling just enough to create a new identity while maintaining some connection to his heritage. He married an Italian woman whose Catholic faith provided spiritual protection against the pagan curse, and he raised his children to speak only English, cutting them off from the Gaelic traditions that carried the family's supernatural obligations. For 20 years, the strategy seemed to work. Samuel prospered as a dock worker, saved enough money to purchase a small house in South Boston, and watched his children grow up free from the hereditary patterns that had destroyed every previous generation of his bloodline. But Gaias are patient entities, and they adapt to circumstances that mortals cannot anticipate. The curse found Samuel's children through the very prosperity he had used to hide from it. His eldest son, Patrick, enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War, seeking to prove his American loyalty and escape the stigma of his immigrant heritage. He died at Gettysburg, shot by Confederate forces while carrying intelligence about Union troop movements, betraying his own side, just as his ancestors had betrayed Brian Boru. His daughter Bridget married into a prominent Boston family and used her position to provide information about Irish nationalist activities to British intelligence agents. She died in the influenza pandemic of 1918, but not before ensuring that several Irish independence leaders were arrested and executed based on intelligence she had provided. The pattern continued through Samuel's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each generation finding new ways to repeat the ancestral crime of betrayal, despite having no conscious knowledge of their family's history. The Gaias had adapted to American circumstances, ensuring that the O'Brien bloodline would continue to produce traitors, regardless of what name they carried or what nation they served. Samuel's great-grandson, FBI agent William O'Brien, discovered the family pattern while investigating Irish Republican Army activities in Boston during the 1970s. His research into his own genealogy revealed the truth about his heritage and the supernatural forces that had shaped his family's destiny for over 9 centuries. But knowledge brought opportunity as well as horror. Working with scholars who specialized in Celtic mythology, William learned that Gaius could be broken through rituals that acknowledged the original crime while making meaningful restitution to those who had been harmed. The ritual required William to travel to Ireland and perform acts of service that would balance the spiritual debt created by his ancestors' betrayal. He spent 3 years working with families whose ancestors had died because of O'Brien treachery, providing financial support and practical assistance while studying the traditional methods for breaking supernatural compulsions. The breakthrough came when William discovered that the Druids, who had pronounced the original Gias, had built a mechanism for its dissolution into the curse itself. The O'Brien bloodline could escape their fate by producing a member who would sacrifice personal prosperity to serve the cause their ancestor had betrayed: Irish independence and cultural preservation. William resigned from the FBI and dedicated his life to supporting Irish cultural organizations in both America and Ireland. He donated his life savings to scholarship funds for students studying Gaelic language and literature. Most importantly, he formally acknowledged his ancestors' crime at a ceremony conducted at the site of Brian Boru's grave, accepting responsibility for the betrayal while committing his bloodline to reversing its effects. The GEAs broke the moment William spoke the words of acknowledgement. Family members who had suffered from chronic ailments found themselves suddenly healthy. Business ventures that had consistently failed began to prosper. Most significantly, William's children showed no signs of the compulsive betrayal that had characterized their bloodline for 34 generations. The O'Brien case demonstrates that family curses can be broken, but only through actions that address their spiritual rather than legal dimensions. Changing names or moving to new locations provides temporary relief at best. Genuine escape requires acknowledgement of ancestral crimes and meaningful restitution to those who were harmed. The Romani tradition of Marime cleansing provides the most sophisticated techniques for purifying bloodlines contaminated by supernatural pollution. These rituals recognize that spiritual contamination operates according to laws that parallel those governing physical contagion. It spreads through contact, persists over time and can only be eliminated through specific purification procedures. The most extensive cleansing ritual in Romani history occurred in 1923, when the Colderaș clan of Romania discovered that their ancestral curse had been triggered by a crime committed during the reign of Vlad the Impaler. Their ancestors had provided information that led to the capture and execution of a Romani family that had been hiding from Vlad's forces, accepting payment in silver that had been stolen from Orthodox churches. The contamination had spread through the Colderaș bloodline for over 4 centuries, manifesting as an inability to accumulate wealth honestly. Every business venture ended in scandal, every inheritance was lost through fraud, and every attempt at legitimate prosperity resulted in exposure of criminal activities that the family had never consciously committed. The cleansing ritual required the entire clan to acknowledge their ancestors' crime, to identify and make restitution to descendants of the murdered family, and to perform acts of service to the Orthodox Church that would balance the spiritual debt created by the theft of sacred objects. Most challenging of all, they had to voluntarily surrender all wealth accumulated through their ancestors' crime, redistributing centuries of accumulated assets to communities that had been harmed by their family's prosperity. The ritual worked, but only because the entire community participated in the cleansing process. Individual members of cursed bloodlines cannot break family curses through personal action alone. The contamination is too deeply embedded in the genetic and spiritual matrix of the bloodline to be neutralized by isolated efforts. This principle explains why modern attempts to escape family curses through individual therapy, legal name changes, or geographical relocation consistently fail. The supernatural forces that create and maintain family curses operate at levels that transcend individual consciousness, requiring collective acknowledgement and communal action to neutralize effectively. Modern medicine has begun to offer forms of scientific curse breaking that operate through biological rather than spiritual mechanisms. Families that carry genes associated with hereditary diseases can prevent the transmission of these conditions to future generations through careful reproductive planning and emerging genetic modification techniques. The biochemist who pioneered CRISPR gene editing technology has spoken cautiously about the possibility of eliminating hereditary conditions that have plagued certain bloodlines for generations. We're approaching the point where genetic destiny is no longer immutable, the research suggests. Families that have carried the burden of hereditary disease for centuries may finally have the tools to break those cycles. But genetic modification cannot address the spiritual dimensions of family curses. The supernatural forces that create and maintain these conditions operate through mechanisms that transcend biological inheritance, affecting families through synchronicity, environmental factors, and psychological influences that no amount of genetic engineering can control. Moreover, attempts to escape family curses through purely technological means often trigger spiritual backlash that manifests as new forms of misfortune, targeting individuals who refuse to acknowledge the non-material dimensions of their inheritance. The forces that create family curses adapt to changing circumstances, finding new ways to extract payment from bloodlines that attempt to escape their obligations through scientific rather than spiritual means. The adoption practices developed by certain religious communities provide alternative models for escaping hereditary spiritual contamination. These traditions recognize that family curses follow bloodlines rather than legal relationships, allowing individuals to escape their inherited fate by severing biological connections and establishing new spiritual genealogies. The Shaker communities of 19th century America developed the most comprehensive adoption protocols for individuals seeking to escape family curses. Their theology recognized that spiritual contamination could be transmitted through biological inheritance, while holding that such contamination could be neutralized through voluntary acceptance into a purified community. Individuals who joined Shaker communities underwent elaborate purification rituals that symbolically severed their connections to their biological families while establishing new spiritual relationships with their adopted community. These rituals included confession of ancestral crimes, renunciation of inherited wealth, and commitment to lifestyles that would prevent the perpetuation of the spiritual patterns that had created their family's problems. The Shaker adoption process worked because it addressed both the individual and communal dimensions of family curses. New community members received the spiritual protection of a group that had collectively committed itself to avoiding the forms of exploitation and injustice that create supernatural contamination. At the same time, they accepted responsibility for maintaining the community's spiritual purity through their own actions and decisions. Contemporary approaches to generational trauma recognize patterns that parallel traditional understandings of family curses, while providing secular frameworks for addressing inherited psychological damage. Research on inherited family trauma has documented how traumatic experiences create biological and psychological changes that persist across multiple generations through mechanisms that operate at both genetic and environmental levels. New therapeutic protocols focus on helping individuals identify the specific traumatic events that created their family's patterns of dysfunction, while developing skills for interrupting the transmission of these patterns to future generations. These approaches combine elements of psychotherapy, genealogical research, and spiritual practice in ways that parallel traditional curse-breaking rituals, while remaining accessible to secular audiences. But this work also reveals the limitations of purely psychological approaches to hereditary trauma. Many families display patterns of misfortune that exceed what can be explained through conventional models of psychological inheritance, suggesting that some family problems operate through mechanisms that current therapeutic theory cannot fully address. The most successful contemporary approaches to breaking family curses combine elements from multiple traditions: psychological insight, spiritual practice, genealogical research, and community support, while adapting these elements to modern circumstances and secular worldviews. Therapeutic techniques that explicitly acknowledge the reality of family curses while providing practical methods for breaking them have emerged from the intersection of Jungian analysis and folk traditions. These approaches recognize that some psychological problems have spiritual dimensions that require spiritual as well as psychological intervention. These protocols involve helping clients identify the specific events in their family history that created patterns of inherited trauma, acknowledge the full scope of damage created by these events, and commit to actions that will prevent the repetition of harmful patterns in future generations. The work emphasizes the importance of making amends for ancestral crimes while breaking cycles of victimization that perpetuate the spiritual conditions that family curses exploit. The future of curse breaking lies not in choosing between traditional and modern approaches, but in integrating the insights of multiple traditions into comprehensive protocols that address the full spectrum of factors that create and maintain family curses. Such integration requires acknowledging that some aspects of human experience operate through mechanisms that current science cannot measure or explain, while using the tools that science provides to address the measurable dimensions of inherited trauma. The blood remembers what the mind forgets, but memory can be healed through actions that acknowledge the past while creating new possibilities for the future. Family curses are not immutable fate, but correctable conditions that respond to genuine acknowledgement, meaningful restitution, and committed action to prevent the repetition of the patterns that created them. But healing requires courage, the courage to face family truths that previous generations preferred to ignore, to accept responsibility for crimes committed by ancestors long dead, and to sacrifice personal comfort for the welfare of future generations who have not yet been born. The choice belongs to each generation. Perpetuate the patterns that created the curse, or accept the responsibility that comes with the power to break chains that have bound their bloodline for centuries. Some chains are broken by legal documents and geographical distance. Others require acknowledgement, restitution, and transformation that reaches into the deepest foundations of identity and purpose. The curse can be broken, but only by those willing to pay the price that freedom demands. A curse doesn't need to be cast. It just needs to be inherited. But inheritance, like memory, is a choice. And sometimes, the greatest courage lies not in carrying forward what came before, but in choosing to become something that the ancestors could never imagine. The blood remembers, but the living can choose what they want the blood to remember. And in that choice lies the power to transform curse into blessing, inherited guilt into inherited grace, and the weight of the past into the foundation for a future where such choices will no longer be necessary.